So hopefully you can see what I'm seeing, these scars on these red maples. So we're by the moose wallow, and if we look at a lot of these red maples, they have these scars where the bark appears to have been peeled off and is either healing over or not completely healing over. And almost all these red maples in this area have those scars. That's made by the moose coming in the spring of the year typically and using their lower incisors. So remember when we talked about the deer aging in lab on the 16th on Monday, we talked about how deer and moose have only lower incisors. They don't have upper incisors on their upper jaw. And what they do is when the sap is running in the spring, sometimes we see it in the fall as well, when nutrients are leaving and being stored in the roots. Moose will come and with their lower incisors scrape the bark and get at that inner cambium layer, that growing layer of the tree bark that is full of moisture and nutrients, and it's fairly concentrated in sugars. So in sugar maples, which have thicker bark, and the moose don't tend to do this, that's the layer that we want to get into in the spring when we're tapping the trees to try to get maple syrup here. And we want to get through that cambium and into what's called the sapwood and get a flow of sap coming out. The moose just do it here. They scrape with those lower incisors and they peel that bark off. And sometimes you can see it goes up the tree. You know, this is 6.5 feet above the ground. Some of these red maples have been peeled multiple times to the point where they get infected with fungus and it causes them to snap in high winds. Some of them are healing over, like this one's healing over pretty well. And what I noticed in this stand in particular is that the moose would come in and do this and hit most of these trees in a given year, and there'd be a lot of fresh bark peeling all over the place. Then they wouldn't come and do that for several years, even though moose were still in the area. They'd be hitting other trees in other spots. And then 5 or 6 years later, they've come back and done it again, right? So these are kind of secondary areas where they've come back and hit the same tree and peeled the bark off again. So again, this is 7 feet or more, 7.5 feet off the ground. Moose will do it. They'll get under with those lower incisors and just strip and peel. And sometimes the peels will run up the tree over 8 or 10 feet above the ground. Peeling away that protective bark, though, exposes the trees to pathogens in the environment. And so while some of them will begin to heal over, other times they don't, and rot sets in, and then these trees are going to be susceptible to being blown over in windstorms or ice storms or with snow loading. As we walk through here, you can see almost all of the red maples have been stripped, have had their bark stripped at one point in time or another, or multiple points in time. Here's another one. Again, this one is not healing. You can see how much dead wood there is here. This one's going to succumb to some kind of wind event eventually. It's not going to survive, even though it's making an attempt. And so moose are a succession agent on the landscape. They are driving forest composition with this selective pressure on certain tree species. So red maples are fairly ubiquitous on our landscape, and they grow in all kinds of sites and conditions. So at a landscape level, moose really aren't a threat to red maple. Red maple is going to regenerate, and when these things die and break over in a storm, they'll sprout from the root system. But as you can see, the damage is lasting, and when these trees succumb and break over, then the regeneration is going to be at a competitive disadvantage to trees that are already established, right? This one, again, was peeled probably 8 or 10 years ago, and there's just rotten, punky wood here that it creates woodpecker habitat and homes for cavity nesting birds and secondary cavity nesters like chickadees. But the tree itself is going to break over and is going to die and then break over. And so you're going to see some of that wind throw in the woods. Back here now we're on the east side of the swamp, and we can just see most of these red maples. Because they have that, when they're young, they have this thin bark that's easy for the moose to get their incisors under and peel. These things are all damaged and susceptible to disease, insects, and then to physical damage from the weather. So that's one way that moose exert a selective pressure on forest composition. Some of it is by browsing, some of it is by this bark stripping action on red maples in particular.